Africa, that was, decades and decades of struggle of bringing to the attention of a community and to the international community where, in fact, what was happening and how it was happening, until it actually became such a strong movement that the regime was ultimately dismantled, the system was dismantled. Or if we look at struggles in Palestine, I mean, nobody here thinks that that is in any way, shape, or form resolved, and has certainly predated the revolution inside of Iran. And the situation with Iraq, I mean, we saw major human rights catastrophes inside of Iraq. Warfare in 1990, again warfare in 2003, we still continue to see huge issues, major problems. And the civil rights movement in this country alone should be a reference point for all of us. The civil rights movement took years until there was any legitimate legislation that was ratified or placed into law, and once that even happened, the enforcement of which was questionable for a very, very, very long time. So I think keeping that in mind is a good way for us to be realistic about what expectations are and what could or will form inside of Iran itself with the movement. In addition, I mentioned briefly of not bringing into or projecting onto Iranians goals or ideas of what it is they should be asking for, or what kind of government that we want to see. And that being said, many people who have come out have their own pre-existing agendas within Iran. Some of it is based simply on two things: on the geography of not simply being inside Iran, but being in the diaspora, and also on generation. Different demands, different things that people want. In the United States, the people who have the loudest voices that are framing the discussion about Iran tend to come from right-wing conservatives who historically and repeatedly have attempted to demonize and dominate Iran. Traditional voices of solidarity from progressives and social justice advocates since the elections, who do in fact support rights to self-determination for Iran, have not been raised forcefully, if at all. These are part of the issues, or sort of the tackling of where we go from here, that we really have to keep in mind as we move forward. In addition, there's a chilling effect, not just for people inside of Iran for fear of what might happen to them, but for people here, Iranians who are here on student visas, people who are Iranian Americans but happen to have family inside of Iran, who fear retaliation for what they might do. So many people are not willing or comfortable using names or their faces to do the type of work that would need to be done to educate our own communities here. In addition, there's a huge, at this time, and growing refugee crisis in Turkey of Iranians. One thing to keep in mind is that once somebody does in fact flee and try to begin the process of resettlement in another country, if you go towards the UNHCR process, one of the requirements prior to resettlement is that you relinquish your activism, that you do not make political statements during the resettlement process. So these are huge obstacles for how we view solidarity movements. Another thing from the vantage point of the United States is simply a balance between what we're advocating for and how that gets perceived. Here we have the struggle, as I said, of some of the loudest voices towards Iran being conservative voices who for years have advocated for military aggression or crippling sanctions against Iran, economic sanctions against Iran. And just now what we have is a rampant renegotiation of sanctions vis-a-vis Iran that's taking place at the UN that will likely go to a vote in March. Many of these conversations that I'm aware of have already taken place, both with Russia and China, various other countries. The US is in the midst of drafting its first resolution proposal. And I have to say, when it comes to this, I have a very strong position. I spent 2 years doing anti-sanctions work vis-a-vis Iraq. I actually traveled to Iraq before the invasion to have somewhat of a firsthand, however limited, I completely acknowledge based on the Iraqi government's grant of access as to what the effects of sanctions were on that country. But what is undisputable are two things. One, that it clearly had a devastating effect on the population of Iraqis. And two, that the actual sanctions system was so grossly manipulated by the US and UK-led entities and agencies pushing them through in the UN that they've lost all trust that we can have in a good faith policy moving forward, even considering the fact, and this was mentioned on the first panel, that when we look at the discussions right now with sanctions, they're all formulated under the language and rhetoric of nuclear negotiations. They have nothing to do with a human rights movement. So what happens when the human rights movement is resolved? Do sanctions get lifted? No, because they're not connected to the human rights issue. They're connected to the nuclear issue. We must continue to keep that in mind. I won't go into great details about historical use of sanctions, but one person that I encourage everybody to look at is a doctor by the name of, professor by the name of Joy Gordon. She has done extensive work on of sanctions policy historically, from its use with South Africa to Serbia to Iraq, you name it, to Cuba. She's really extensively looked on how, if any, utility sanctions have in targeting regimes and their actions. And I think for any of us who is looking at how you respond to what's happening inside of Iran, it is part of that responsible action that we do that research and we understand it. I also want to just simply say that there have been sanctions against Iran for years. That currently humanitarian and relief organizations in the U.S. are completely blocked from working in Iran at all. That the U.S. government has basically does business with companies that provide the Iranian government with tools to spy on Iranians. That the U.S. That in addition, American anti-censorship software is prevented from being sent to Iran. That certain technologies that we see now are being used very crucially and critically by the movement, like Google and software and these things, have in some ways been restricted from their ability to provide these types of services to Iranians. So this also is something to keep in mind when we have these debates. I also just want to, that sort of brings us to how we choose what actions that we do, to contextualize our role within this work. And that said, as a group here in New York, we've been very conscious of what has happened inside of Iran. What you saw was Iranians have been very creative in the way that they've tried to move forward some of their messaging. There have been stories from friends who came back after Ashura who said that, you know, it was very amazing just to watch people sort of walk through the streets, and what you saw was there were these casual but conscious placements of green on people's clothing or around their wrist, something that could be hidden if they needed it to, but that was clearly visible and aware for people to see. That when processions would walk by with huge pictures of Khomeini, people would sort of turn their back to the procession until they walked by completely. That when there were graffiti on the walls, you know, that the government agents sort of tried to mock up or make look like some opposition some opposition protester did not in fact put it up there, that people